The sea was restless the night he was born. Waves struck the shore with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as though the world itself understood that something had entered it, something that did not fully belong. The wind carried a chill through the air, whispering across the sands, brushing against stone, stirring the quiet unease that lingers before destiny takes form. In the house of Peleus, a child drew his first breath, not with the fragility of ordinary life, but with something sharper, something heavier. His mother stood over him, silent, her gaze fixed not on the present, but on what lay ahead. Thetis did not see a newborn child. She saw time unfolding. She saw a path already written, and she saw how it ended. Achilles. The name would come to define more than a man. It would become a symbol of power, of rage, of something dangerously close to perfection. But in this moment, there was no glory, only the quiet tension between what he was and what he would become. Thetis lifted him gently, her touch careful, almost reverent, for she understood something few ever would. To bring a child into the world is one thing. To know exactly how that child will suffer is another entirely. The prophecy had come before his first cry, not spoken loudly, not declared in the halls of kings, but whispered, carried through divine knowledge, impossible to escape. Achilles would be great, unmatched in battle, unrivaled among men. His name would outlive empires, but he would not live long enough to see it. A choice lay before him, though he was far too young to understand it. A life of obscurity, long, quiet, unremarkable, or a life of glory, brilliant, unforgettable, and short. Thetis had heard it, and she refused to accept it. The world of men might bend to fate, but she was not merely of that world. She was divine, and divinity does not surrender easily. In the quiet hours before dawn, she carried the child beyond the walls, beyond the reach of mortal sight, to where the boundary between worlds thinned. The air grew colder, heavier. The silence deepened, as though even the earth hesitated to witness what would come next. There, hidden from the waking world, lay the waters that defied nature itself. The river Styx, dark, still, endless. Its surface did not ripple, it did not reflect, it absorbed. A boundary not just between life and death, but between what is and what cannot be undone. Thetis stepped forward, her expression unchanging, though beneath it something trembled. Not doubt, she had passed that, but something deeper, understanding. She held Achilles over the water for a moment, her grip firm around his heel, the only point of contact, the only part of him that would not be touched. Then She lowered him in. The water did not splash. It did not resist. It accepted. Achilles' body disappeared beneath the surface for a single, suspended moment. Time stretching, bending, holding its breath. And when she lifted him back into the world, something had changed. His skin carried no mark, no visible sign of transformation, but the shift was undeniable. He was no longer entirely vulnerable. Thetis looked at him, searching for something. Confirmation, perhaps, that she had succeeded, that she had altered the path, rewritten the ending. But fate is not so easily broken, because even as she held him, her hand remained on his heel. One small point, one place untouched. In what was meant to be perfection, and flaws have a way of defining everything. Years passed, but the shadow of that moment never left her. Achilles grew, not as other children did, but with a presence that seemed to expand with him. Strength came naturally. Speed followed. His body responded to training as though it had been made for it, because in many ways it had. He was taught by masters, warriors, thinkers, even the wise centaur Chiron, who shaped heroes from raw potential, saw something different in him, something sharper, something closer to inevitability than possibility. Achilles learned quickly, too quickly. Where others struggled, he excelled. Where others hesitated, he acted. There was no uncertainty in him when it came to action, only instinct, refined and perfected. And yet, beneath it all, something remained unresolved, because Achilles did not belong fully to the world he walked in. Among mortals, he was more. Among the divine, he was less. A line drawn through his very existence, and lines like that demand to be crossed. Thetis watched him as he grew, her silence deepening with each passing year. She saw the way others looked at him, the admiration, the expectation, the quiet certainty that he was destined for something greater than all of them. And she knew where that path led. She had tried to prevent it, tried to protect him from it. But destiny does not disappear. It waits. And when the time comes, it calls. The call came as all such things do, not with subtlety, but with inevitability. War. The world began to shift, alliances forming, tensions breaking into something far more violent. The distant city of Troy stood at the center of it, a conflict that would draw kings, warriors, and legends, and among them, Achilles. He heard of it before it reached him. The whispers, the preparations, the gathering of forces. It spread like fire, consuming everything in its path. And within it, there was something undeniable: opportunity, glory, the very thing the prophecy had promised. Thetis stood before him when the truth could no longer be avoided. There was no illusion left to maintain, no protection strong enough to hide him from what was coming. "If you go," she said, her voice quieter than it had ever been, "you will not return." No anger, no command, only truth. Achilles met her gaze, and for the first time, there was something uncertain in him. Not fear, but awareness. He understood. The choice was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It stood before him now, clear and absolute. A long life, unknown, or a short life, remembered forever. Silence stretched between them. The wind moved softly through the air, carrying with it the weight of what could not be undone. Achilles looked toward the horizon, towards something unseen, and in that moment, he chose not safety, not obscurity, but meaning, even if that meaning would destroy him. "I will go," he said. The words were simple, but they carried everything. Thetis closed her eyes briefly, as though holding on to something that was already slipping away. When she opened them again, there was no resistance left. Because the choice had been made and fate had been accepted, the ships would soon gather, the war would begin, and Achilles, not yet a legend, not yet a name spoken with awe and fear, would step onto a path that led only one way, toward glory, toward rage, toward death. The shores of Troy did not tremble when the ships arrived. They endured. Wave after wave of black-hulled vessels cut across the sea, their sails swollen with wind, their prows carving through the water like blades. Thousands of men stepped onto foreign sand, warriors drawn from distant lands, united not by loyalty, but by purpose. War had come, and with it, Achilles. He did not arrive with ceremony. No declaration marked his presence. No grand display separated him from the others as he stepped onto the shore. And yet, he was noticed. Because there are men who must announce themselves, and there are men whose presence speaks for them. Achilles was the latter. Among the gathered forces stood kings and commanders, men of power, men of influence. Agamemnon ruled them in name, his authority binding the coalition together. But power in title is not the same as power in reality, and reality, on the battlefield, belonged to Achilles. The first clash came quickly. There is no patience in war, no gradual beginning, only the sudden eruption of violence as steel meets flesh and the air fills with the sound of men colliding with fate. Achilles moved through it as though it had been waiting for him. Not chaotic, not reckless, precise. Every step carried intention, every strike inevitability. His spear did not hesitate, his shield did not falter. He advanced not with fury, but with clarity, a perfect alignment of body and purpose. Men fell before him, not in struggle, but in certainty. There was no wasted movement, no excess. His strength was not wild. It was controlled, directed, refined into something almost unnatural. To face him was not to engage in battle. It was to meet an outcome already decided. The Trojans saw it first, in the way their lines broke where he moved, in the hesitation that spread, subtle at first, then undeniable. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it begins as recognition of something beyond what can be overcome. Achilles did not chase glory in those moments. He embodied it, and word spread quickly through the camps, through the ranks, through the quiet conversations that pass between soldiers when night falls and the fires burn low. There was a name now, a force, a presence that reshaped the battle itself. Achilles. But even perfection carries its own isolation. Among the warriors, he stood apart, not because he sought distance, but because it formed naturally around him. Few could match him. Fewer still could understand him, except one, Patroclus. Where Achilles was sharp, Patroclus was steady. Where Achilles moved like a force of nature, Patroclus moved with quiet awareness. He did not seek the center of battle, nor did he shrink from it. He existed beside Achilles, not as a shadow, but as a balance. They spoke often, though rarely of war itself, because war, to Achilles, was simple. It was everything else. That was complicated. You don't have to prove anything, Patroclus said once, as they sat beyond the noise of the camp, the distant echoes of preparation and tension fading into the background. Achilles did not respond immediately, because the statement itself was flawed. I do, he said at last. Patroclus studied him for a moment, the flicker of firelight casting shifting shadows across his face. To them, Achilles shook his head slightly. To time, the words lingered, because that was the truth of it. This was not about victory, not about conquest, not even about Troy. It was about something far more intangible. Legacy. Achilles fought not to win a war, but to ensure that he would never be forgotten. And in that pursuit, there is no limit. Days turned into battles, battles into patterns. Achilles became the center of it all, the point around which outcomes shifted. When he fought, the Greeks advanced. When he rested, the balance faltered. It became clear, too clear, that the war itself had begun to depend on him. and dependence breeds tension. Agamemnon saw it, not as admiration, but as threat, because authority, when challenged, even indirectly, demands response. The king watched as Achilles' name spread further than his own, as victories were attributed not to strategy, but to strength, as soldiers spoke not of command, but of the warrior who could not be stopped. This was not sustainable, not for a king. The fracture began quietly. A disagreement, a dispute over spoils, something small on the surface, but beneath it, something much larger. Because in war, honor is currency, and to take a man's honor is to take something far greater than possession. It happened before the assembled leaders, the air thick with tension, the unspoken lines of authority drawn sharply between them. Agamemnon stood at the center, his presence firm, his decision already made. Briseis, the name meant little to most, but not to Achilles. She had been given to him as a prize, a symbol of his victories, of his place within the structure of the army. And now, Agamemnon claimed her, not out of need, but to assert control. "You take from me," Achilles said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a force that silenced those around him. "I take what is mine to command," Agamemnon replied. The words were deliberate, provocative, because this was no longer about the woman. It was about power. Achilles stepped forward slightly, his presence shifting, the air around him tightening. "You would take what I have earned, to prove that you can." Agamemnon did not move. "I would remind you," he said, "that you are not above me." Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. In that moment, the battlefield disappeared. The war, the enemy, the purpose, all of it faded beneath something far more immediate. Pride. Achilles felt it, sharp and unrelenting, not wounded in body, but in identity. He had given them victory. He had carried their war. And now, he was being diminished, reduced, controlled. The choice formed instantly, not from logic, but from something deeper. "If you take what is mine," Achilles said slowly, "then you will fight without me." The words struck harder than any weapon, because everyone present understood what they meant. This was not defiance. This was withdrawal. And without Achilles, everything would change. Agamemnon held his ground. "Then leave," he said. And just like that, the fracture became final. Achilles turned away, not in hesitation, not in doubt, but in decision. He walked from the assembly, from the war, from the very thing he had chosen only a short time before. Behind him, the army remained, but something essential had been removed, because the greatest warrior among them would no longer fight. That night, the fires burned lower. The sounds of preparation felt different, uncertain, because war had not ended. But the force that had driven it forward had stepped away, and in the distance, beyond the camps, the walls of Troy stood unchanged, waiting, because the war was far from over, and the consequences of pride had only just begun. The battlefield did not stop when Achilles left it. War does not pause for pride. It continues, relentless, indifferent, consuming whatever stands within its reach. And without Achilles, the balance began to shift. At first, the change was subtle, a hesitation in the Greek advance, a break in momentum where once there had been certainty. The lines still held, the formations remained, but something essential had been removed, something that could not be replaced by command or numbers, because war is not won by armies alone. It is won by presence, and Achilles had been that presence. Now, there was absence. The Trojans felt it before they understood it. The pressure that had once driven them back began to ease. Their defenses strengthened, their movements grew bolder, and at their center stood Hector, steady, unwavering, a man who did not fight for glory, but for something far more grounded. Home, where Achilles fought for legacy, Hector fought for survival, and in that difference lay the turning of the war. The Greeks began to lose ground, not all at once, not in a single decisive moment, but piece by piece, inch by inch, as the absence of Achilles rippled through every encounter. Victories became harder, losses more frequent, confidence eroded, and still Achilles did not move. He remained apart from it all, seated near the shore, where the sea met the land in endless repetition. The sound of waves filled the silence around him, a rhythm that neither demanded nor questioned. He watched the horizon more than the battlefield, as though the war had already ended for him, but it had not ended for those still fighting. Among them, Patroclus. He saw what Achilles refused to see, the strain in the ranks, the exhaustion in the men, the quiet desperation that settled in when hope begins to falter. He fought where he could, stood where he was needed, but he was not Achilles. No one was. And the cost of that absence grew heavier with each passing day. At night, the fires burned lower than before. Conversations grew shorter. The certainty that had once filled the camp was gone, replaced by something colder. Doubt. Patroclus found Achilles as he always did, by the shore, the sea stretching endlessly before him, untouched by the war unfolding behind. "You hear them," Patroclus said, his voice calm but firm. Achilles did not turn. "The war continues," he replied. "It continues without you." Silence. Not denial. Not disagreement. Just silence. Patroclus stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Achilles, searching for something beneath the stillness. "They are dying," he said, "not because they are weak, not because they are unworthy, but because you are not there." Achilles' jaw tightened slightly, but his expression did not change. "They chose this war," he said, "and so did you." The words struck deeper than any accusation, because they were true. Achilles had chosen this path, chosen the war, chosen the fate that came with it. And yet now he had stepped away. "Is this what you wanted?" Patroclus pressed. "To be remembered as the one who could have changed everything and chose not to?" Achilles turned then, his gaze sharp, controlled. But beneath it, something stirred. "You speak of things you do not understand. Then make me understand." The tension between them held, quiet but unyielding. This was not anger, not yet. This was something more fragile, something closer to fracture. "They took from me," Achilles said at last, his voice lower now, carrying weight. "They dishonored me, treated me as if I were nothing more than another soldier to command. And so you let them fall?" The question hung in the air. Achilles did not answer, because there was no answer that could justify it. Only truth. And truth is often unbearable. Patroclus exhaled slowly, the tension in him shifting, not into anger, but into resolve. "If you will not fight," he said, "then let me." Achilles' eyes narrowed slightly. "You are not me. I do not need to be." A pause, measured, dangerous. "The men do not need you to be invincible," Patroclus continued. "They need to believe that you are still with them, that you have not abandoned them completely." The implication settled between them, clear, unavoidable. Achilles understood. His armor, his presence, his legend, all of it could still influence the war, even if he did not fight. "No," Achilles said immediately. The response was sharp, instinctive, but Patroclus did not retreat. "They are losing," he said, "and if they fall, this war ends without you, without your glory, without your name." That struck, not because it appealed to vanity, but because it touched something deeper, purpose. Achilles had chosen this path for a reason. To walk away from it now was to erase that choice entirely. The silence stretched, long, heavy, and within it the decision formed. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. "You will wear my armor," Achilles said. Patroclus did not move. "You will drive them back. You will remind them who we are. But you will not go too far." His gaze hardened. "You will not seek glory. You will not chase victory beyond what is necessary. You will return." Patroclus nodded. "I will. But promises are not always kept." The next morning, the armor of Achilles shone once more in the light of battle. The sight of it alone was enough to stir something in the Greek ranks, a return of belief, of strength, of something they had nearly lost. Achilles had returned, or so they thought. Patroclus stepped into the battlefield carrying not just the weight of the armor, but the weight of expectation, and for a time, it worked. The Trojans faltered, the lines broke, the momentum shifted once more. Where Achilles had once stood, Patroclus now advanced, his movement strong, his strikes effective. The illusion held. The Greeks surged forward. Victory seemed possible again. But something changed. Slowly, subtly, the retreat of the Trojans became pursuit. The push forward became momentum. And momentum is difficult to control. Patroclus felt it. The rise of something within him. Something that mirrored what he had seen in Achilles so many times before. The pull toward more. Not just defense, not just survival, but victory. He pressed forward, further than he should have, further than Achilles had allowed, and beyond the shifting lines of battle. Someone was waiting. Hector stepped forward, his presence steady, his purpose clear. He saw through the illusion, not in the armor, not in the movement, but in something deeper. This was not Achilles. This was something else. And that changed everything. The two forces moved toward each other, drawn not by chance, but by inevitability. The battlefield seemed to narrow around them, the noise fading into something distant as the moment sharpened. Patroclus stood in the armor of a legend. Hector stood in defense of everything he protected. And between them, there would be no misunderstanding, only truth. The battlefield had become something else, no longer a clash of armies, but a convergence. All motion, all violence, all sound, pulling inward toward a single point, toward a moment that neither side could yet see, but both were already moving toward. Patroclus advanced beneath the armor of Achilles, and the illusion still held. From a distance, there was no difference. the same gleam of bronze, the same unstoppable force. The Trojans faltered as he approached, their lines bending, their certainty cracking beneath the weight of what they believed had returned. Achilles. The name alone carried fear, and fear wins battles before they begin. Patroclus drove them back with precision, his movements guided by skill, but fueled now by something else, something growing, something dangerous. Momentum. He had pushed them from the ships. He had broken their advance. He had done what Achilles asked. But the battlefield did not feel finished. Victory lingered just beyond reach. And that was enough. He pressed forward, further than he should have, further than he had promised. The ground beneath his feet shifted from defense to pursuit, from necessity to ambition. The air thickened with heat, with dust, with the rising intensity of a battle that refused to end cleanly. Behind him, the Greek lines followed, their confidence restored, their strength renewed. Before him, the gates of Troy loomed in the distance, and somewhere between those two forces, a presence waited. Hector stepped forward, not with haste, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of a man who understood exactly what stood before him. He had watched the advance, felt the shift, seen the armor. But Hector was not a man who relied on appearances. There was something different here, something beneath the surface that did not align. This was not Achilles, and yet it wore his face. The battlefield narrowed as they approached each other, the noise fading into something distant, as though the world itself had drawn back to witness what was about to unfold. Patroclus did not hesitate. He moved forward with force, with intent, carrying the full weight of the illusion into the strike. Their weapons met, not with chaos, but with clarity. Hector did not break, did not falter, and in that instant, the truth became undeniable. This was no godlike warrior. This was a man. The fight shifted. What had begun as dominance became resistance. What had felt inevitable now demanded effort. Patroclus pressed harder, faster, driving forward with everything he had built in those moments of borrowed identity. But Hector matched him, step for step, strike for strike, and slowly the illusion began to fracture. Patroclus felt it before he understood it, the rhythm breaking, the certainty slipping. This was no longer a continuation of Achilles' power. This was his own, and it was not enough. Still, he fought, because there was no turning back now. The dust thickened around them, the clash of bronze echoing sharply, the air itself tightening with each passing second. The world had narrowed to two figures, bound not just by battle, but by consequence. Then, a moment, small, almost invisible, but decisive, a misstep, a shift in balance, the kind that, in any other fight, might be recovered, but not here, not now. Hector saw it, and Hector acted. The strike came clean, unrelenting, final. Patroclus staggered, the force of it breaking through not just armor, but illusion. The breath left him in a sharp, involuntary release, the world tilting as his strength faltered. The armor of Achilles could not protect what he was not. He fell, not with grandeur, not with noise, but with a quiet, undeniable finality. The battlefield seemed to pause, not in silence, but in recognition. Something had ended, something that could not be undone. Hector stood over him, breathing steady, his gaze fixed not on the armor, but on the man beneath it. And in that moment, he understood. This was not Achilles. This was something far more dangerous, because Achilles still lived, and this death would not go unanswered. Hector removed the helmet slowly, revealing the face beneath. Not the legend, not the invincible force they had feared, but Patroclus. The realization settled heavily. Not victory, not relief, but something closer to inevitability, because he knew what would follow. Far from the battlefield, beyond the reach of the clash, the sound arrived differently, not as noise, not as chaos, but as absence, a shift in something unseen. Achilles felt it before the words reached him. The sea moved as it always had, the waves rising and falling in endless repetition. But something beneath that rhythm had changed, something deeper. He stood slowly, as though the world itself had grown heavier, and when the messenger came, when the truth was spoken, it did not strike all at once. It settled, slowly, relentlessly. Patroclus was dead. The words did not feel real, not at first, because reality has a way of resisting what it cannot contain. Achilles said nothing, did nothing, for a moment that stretched beyond measure. Then, something broke, not outwardly, not in violence, but inwardly, completely. The stillness that had defined him, the control, the distance, all of it collapsed beneath the weight of something far more powerful than pride. Grief, raw, unforgiving, absolute. He fell to his knees, not in weakness, but in surrender to something he could not fight. The air seemed to vanish, the world narrowing, folding inward as the reality settled fully into place. Patroclus was gone, and with him, something of Achilles had gone as well. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something darker, something rising, because grief does not remain still. It changes. It sharpens. It becomes something else. Achilles' hands clenched against the ground, his breath uneven, his body trembling, not with fear, but with the force of something building beneath the surface. The loss was unbearable, but what came after was inevitable. He stood slowly, his expression no longer uncertain, no longer conflicted. There was no hesitation left, no pride, no question, only purpose. The war he had abandoned had returned to him, but not as it had been before. This was no longer about honor, no longer about glory, no longer about choice. This was something far more final. Revenge. And revenge does not ask for restraint. It demands everything. Achilles turned from the sea, from the place where he had tried to escape what he had chosen. The path before him was no longer divided. There was only one direction left. Back to the battlefield. Back to Troy. Back to the man who had taken everything from him. Hector. The war would begin again. But this time, it would not be driven by kings, or armies, or destiny. It would be driven by something far more dangerous, the rage of Achilles. Dawn did not break gently. It tore across the horizon like a wound, bleeding light into a world that no longer deserved it. The battlefield lay waiting, scarred and restless, as though it too sensed what was coming. Because something had changed, not in the armies, not in the war, but in the man who now walked toward it. Achilles had returned, but not as he had been before. The warrior who once fought for glory, for legacy, for something beyond himself, was gone. What remained was something colder, something sharper, something that did not seek victory, but release. The armor he wore gleamed with a new, terrible clarity, crafted by divine hands, said to be forged by Hephaestus himself. It did not shine with pride. It burned with purpose. And as he stepped onto the field, the war itself seemed to hesitate. The Trojans saw him first, not through recognition, but through instinct. Because there are moments when danger transcends sight, when something deeper, more ancient, stirs within and whispers a single truth. Run. But there was nowhere to run. Achilles moved forward, and the world broke around him. There was no strategy now, no measured advance, only destruction. He did not fight like a man. He fought like consequence. Every strike carried the full weight of his grief, his loss, his fury, unrestrained, unfiltered, absolute. Men fell not because they were weaker, but because they existed in his path. The ground became slick beneath his feet. The air thickened with dust and blood. The sounds of battle warped into something distorted, something distant, as though even the chaos itself could not keep pace with what he had become. He did not stop. He did not slow. And those who stood before him did not survive. The river ran red that day. It carried more than bodies. It carried the unraveling of something sacred. Because war, for all its violence, still holds rules, still holds limits. Achilles had abandoned them. He hunted, not as a soldier, but as something far more primal. And in the distance, behind the walls of Troy, the truth settled heavily into the hearts of those who understood what this meant. Hector. Hector stood at the gates, watching as the battlefield collapsed into chaos beneath a single force. He saw the way his men fell, the way their formation shattered, the way fear spread not in whispers, but in waves. He knew why. He knew who. And he knew this was inevitable. There are moments in a man's life when choice disappears, when the path before him narrows into something singular, something unavoidable. This was that moment. Hector did not retreat behind the walls. He did not hide within the safety of stone and distance, because some things cannot be escaped, and some men do not try. He stepped forward, alone, the gates of Troy behind him, the storm before him, and between them, a silence that cut deeper than any blade. Achilles saw him, not as a figure in the distance, not as a warrior among many, but as the end of something, the focus of everything that had led him here. The man who had taken Patroclus from him, the man who now stood and waited. The battlefield seemed to fall away, not in reality, but in perception, because nothing else mattered now. Only this, only them. Achilles advanced slowly, each step deliberate, each movement carrying the weight of something final. His rage did not flare wildly. It had settled into something far more dangerous. Control. Hector stood his ground, though the weight of what approached him was undeniable. He had seen Achilles before, had fought against his presence, endured his force. But this was different. This was not a warrior. This was loss made flesh. And even so, he did not move. Their eyes met. And in that moment, everything was understood without words. Achilles spoke first, his voice low, steady, devoid of anything but certainty. You took him from me. No accusation, no question, only truth. Hector did not deny it. He came to fight, he said, and he fell as all men do. The words were not cruel, but they were not enough, because there is no justification for loss, only consequence. The space between them closed, and then they moved. The clash was immediate, violent, final. Hector fought with everything he had: skill, strength, purpose. He was no lesser warrior, no unworthy opponent. His movements were precise, his strikes calculated, his defense unyielding. But Achilles was beyond all of that. He did not fight to win. He fought to end. The force of his attacks drove Hector back, step by step, the ground beneath them shifting, the tension building with every passing second. The outcome was not uncertain, only delayed. Hector saw it, felt it, understood it, and still he fought, because honor does not retreat. Even when defeat is certain, the final moment came not with spectacle, but with inevitability. Achilles struck, and Hector fell. The world seemed to still, not in silence, but in recognition. A line had been crossed. Something had ended. But Achilles did not stop. He stood over Hector's body, his breath steady, his gaze empty of anything resembling peace. This was not victory. This was not closure, because nothing could restore what had been taken. And so, he went further. He bound Hector's body to his chariot, not in honor, not in respect, but in defiance of both. And as he dragged it across the dust, before the walls of Troy, before the eyes of those who watched in horror, the transformation became complete. This was no longer the hero they had known. This was something else, something broken, something lost. The war had taken from him, and in return, he had abandoned what remained of himself. The sun fell slowly, casting long shadows across a battlefield that had seen too much, endured too much. Achilles stood apart once more, but not as he had before. There was no calm now, no reflection, only emptiness, because revenge had not healed him. It had hollowed him, and in that hollow space, something waited. Not rage, not grief, but something quieter, something inevitable, because even now, the war was not finished, and neither was his fate. Night fell differently after Hector's death, not with silence, but with weight, The fires of the Greek camp burned low, their light flickering against bronze and shadow, illuminating men who no longer spoke of victory, but of something harder to name, something that lingered beneath the surface of what they had witnessed, because what Achilles had done did not feel like triumph, it felt like an ending, and yet he was still alive. Hector's body lay where it had been cast, dragged through dust and grief, its dignity stripped away beneath the relentless force of a rage that refused to quiet. Each day, Achilles returned to it, not to honor, but to continue, as though repetition might complete what vengeance could not. But vengeance does not complete anything. It only consumes. And Achilles, though unmatched in battle, had begun to feel its cost. The anger that had once driven him forward had settled into something colder. Not gone, never gone, but transformed. Exhaustion, not of the body, but of the soul, because there is a limit to rage. And when that limit is reached, what remains is emptiness. It was in that emptiness that something unexpected arrived, not with force, not with fear, but with quiet courage. An old man walked into the Greek camp under the cover of darkness, his steps slow but unwavering, his presence fragile, yet undeniable. He passed unseen where others would have been struck down without hesitation, guided not by strength, but by something deeper: desperation, love. Priam, king of the city that still stood beyond the battlefield, entered the space of his enemy alone. He did not come as a ruler. He came as a father. Achilles did not hear him approach. He did not sense the shift, the quiet intrusion into the space he had claimed for his grief and his rage. Not until the old man stood before him and knelt. The movement was small, but it carried more weight than any battle. Achilles looked at him, his expression unreadable, his mind slow to grasp what stood before him, not because it was unclear, but because it should not have been possible. Priam bowed his head, his voice trembling not with fear, but with something far more powerful. "I have done what no man should do," he said softly. "I have come to the one who killed my son, and I ask you to see me." The words hung in the air, not as a plea, but as truth. Achilles did not respond, not yet, because something unfamiliar had begun to stir within him, something that had been buried beneath layers of anger, of loss, of everything he had allowed himself to become. Recognition. Priam lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting Achilles with a clarity that cut through everything else. "I have kissed the hands that took his life," he said, "the hands that took my son." And in that moment, the world shifted, not outwardly, not in the war, or the armies, or the fate that still waited ahead, but within Achilles. Because standing before him was not an enemy, not a king, but a man who had lost what he himself had lost. A father, a reflection. Achilles saw it then, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. He saw Peleus, far away, growing older with each passing day, waiting, not knowing if his son would return. He saw the future that had already been promised, the grief that would come, the inevitability of it all. And suddenly, the rage that had consumed him began to fracture, not disappear, but break apart beneath the weight of something far more human. He exhaled slowly, the sound unsteady, unfamiliar, and for the first time since Patroclus had died, Achilles wept, not in fury, not in despair, but in understanding. The two men sat together in the quiet that followed, the space between them no longer defined by war, but by loss. No words were needed, because nothing needed to be explained. Achilles rose at last, his movements slower now, stripped of the sharpness that had defined him. He turned, stepping toward the place where Hector's body lay. For a moment, he stood there, silent. Then, carefully, he lifted it, not as an object, not as a symbol, but as a man. He brought Hector back, not to the battlefield, but to his father. Priam received him with trembling hands, his grief no lessened, but no longer alone. And in that act, something shifted, not in the war, but in Achilles, because he had remembered something he had nearly lost entirely, what it meant to be human. But fate does not pause for understanding. It does not change because a man has found clarity, or because he has remembered who he once was. It continues, unmoved, unchanged, and Achilles' path had already been chosen. The war would go on, the battles would continue. But for Achilles, the ending was no longer distant. It had drawn near, closer with each step he had taken, each choice he had made, each moment that had shaped him into what he had become. The day came without warning, as all final moments do. The battlefield once again stretched before him, the sounds of war rising as they always had. But this time, there was no rage driving him forward, only acceptance. He moved through the fight not as a storm, but as something quieter, something resolved, and somewhere within the chaos, a figure waited. Paris. Not the strongest, not the bravest, but part of the same story, part of the same inevitable end. He drew his bow, his hands guided not by skill alone, but by something unseen, something divine. Apollo. The arrow left the string. It cut through the air with silent precision, its path unbroken, its purpose absolute